For 2 decades, he held 2 pregnant sisters captive, the most consanguineous and feared monster of the Appalachians. Hidden for decades in the depths of the mountains, shrouded by mist where the whistle of the wind between the pine trees is the only sound breaking the silence, is one of American history's most disturbing cases. This is the story of Ezekiel Blackwood, a man who, between 1938 and 1958, turned his family into a grotesque genetic experiment, keeping it hidden from the eyes of society for nearly 20 years. The Appalachian Mountains, with their remote communities and isolated valleys, have always been known to harbor secrets. In McDowell County, Western Virginia, these secrets grew darker than anyone could possibly imagine. The Blackwood property and Ezekiel's distorted vision. The Blackwood family established their property in this region, known for extreme poverty during the Great Depression and its coal mines, setting themselves apart from everyone and everything. The Blackwood property lay at the end of an almost impassable dirt road, surrounded on all sides by dense forests. A few small, makeshift huts served as extensions of the main residence, an old, 2-story wood construction, which remained partially hidden by centenary trees, forming a family complex isolated from the rest of the world. Ezekiel Blackwood, born in 1905, was the son of miners who died when he was only 12. Mistreated by a distant uncle who raised him, he developed an authoritarian and reclined personality. In 1930, he inherited the family property and brought his 2 younger sisters, Ruth, then 16, and Martha, 18, to live with him. The 3 siblings lived in isolation, having minimal contact with the local community. What nobody knew was that behind those worn wood walls, Ezekiel had begun to implement a distorted view of family preservation, one that would lead to a genetic nightmare of unimaginable proportions. He held a peculiar theory, explains Dr. Thomas Morgan, a historian specializing in isolated Appalachian communities, based on a distorted grasp of genetics and influenced by eugenic concepts circulating at the time. Ezekiel was obsessed with the idea of creating a pure Blackwood lineage, believing that the mixing of family blood would strengthen specific characteristics he deemed superior. The beginning of the macabre plan. Martha Blackwood's first pregnancy occurred in 1938. The closest neighbors, who lived over 5 kilometers away, believed she had married a man from another city. This purported husband was never seen by anyone, but the explanation was accepted without question, as privacy was respected almost as a religion in that region and time. People in that place and time lived by an unwritten code, says 93-year-old Eliza Jenkins, one of the few living people who had contact with the Blackwoods. You minded your own business and let others mind theirs. That's how we survived in the mountains. What Eliza and others didn't know was that there was no husband. Martha was expecting her own brother, Ezekiel's son, the start of a macabre plan that would span over 2 decades. Less than a year later, Ruth also became pregnant. Again, a story about a marriage to an outsider was spread to explain the situation. But within that isolated property, the 2 sisters had become prisoners of their own brother, forced to bear children in a warped attempt to raise what Ezekiel called the perfect lineage of the Blackwood. Records found decades later reveal that Martha gave birth to 9 children, while Ruth had 7, between 1938 and 1958. 16 children were born of consanguineous unions, condemned before they even arrived in the world. We must understand that knowledge about consanguinity's effects existed then, but it wasn't widespread, especially in isolated rural communities, explains Dr. Caroline Fisher, a West Virginia geneticist. Sibling unions were universally taboo, though weddings between cousins were relatively common in some rural areas until the mid-20th century. Ezekiel was deliberately challenging social norms, not just ignoring them, based on his own distorted theories. The genetic consequences were devastating. Devastating genetic consequences and extreme isolation. Records indicate that of the 16 children born, only 11 survived past early childhood. Among the survivors, serious health problems were the rule, not the exception. When we consider close consanguinity, such as between siblings, we face a scenario where harmful recessive genes are much more likely to manifest themselves, Dr. Fisher continues. This can lead to a variety of conditions, ranging from congenital heart problems and physical deformities to severe intellectual disabilities. Martha's first child, Joseph, born in 1938, initially appeared healthy, offering Ezekiel false confirmation of his theories. As more children were born, however, the problems began to manifest more and more evidently. Martha's fifth son, born in 1945, died before turning 2 due to a severe cardiac malformation. Ruth's third daughter was born with polydactyly, having 6 fingers on each hand. To maintain his terrible secret, Ezekiel rarely permitted the children to leave the property. The few who were occasionally seen in the nearest town were always accompanied by Ezekiel himself, who explained their unusual appearances as the result of a family disease. This extreme isolation was crucial for the horror to continue for such a long time. Ezekiel controlled all aspects of life on the property. He alone went to the city to buy supplies and interact with the outside world. Martha and Ruth, effectively prisoners, cared for the children and kept the property running under their brother's vigilant eye. The control he exerted was absolute, says Dr. Morgan. Based on the diaries found later, we know Ezekiel kept a meticulous record of every birth, every pregnancy, and even the physical characteristics each child developed. It was as if he were conducting a horrible experiment, using his own family as guinea pigs. The perfect environment for this situation to continue undiscovered for nearly 2 decades was created by the isolation, widespread poverty of the region, and the natural distrust of outsiders. Following the unwritten mountain code not to interfere with the affairs of others, the few people who occasionally suspected something was wrong hesitated to get involved. Life on the Blackwood property, a dysfunctional microcosm. A separate world, isolated and governed by Ezekiel's distorted laws, was the environment where the Blackwood children grew up. The property, with its approximately 15 hectares of rugged land, had become a microcosm where societal rules did not apply. As the number of children increased over the years, Ezekiel expanded the property's facilities. Small cabins were built around the main house, creating a type of isolated community. Older children helped care for the younger ones, establishing a complex and dysfunctional hierarchy. Joseph, the firstborn, born in 1938, assumed a position of authority second only to Ezekiel's. He developed significant behavioral problems, despite having no apparent serious physical deformities. Subsequent reports from neighbors describe a young man with erratic behavior, alternating between violent outbursts of anger and periods of extreme docility. What we observe in Joseph's case is a classic example of the neurological effects that can result from consanguinity, explains Dr. Robert Patterson, a neuropsychiatrist at the University of Pittsburgh. Studies show that children from closely consanguineous relationships are more prone to developing neurochemical imbalances that affect behavior, even without obvious physical deformities. Rebecca, Ruth's first daughter, born in 1939, had a condition known as heterochromia, eyes of different colors, one brown and one blue. Although this condition itself isn't necessarily a result of consanguinity, in her case, it was accompanied by severe hearing impairment. Despite these limitations, records suggest Rebecca developed a remarkable intelligence, creating a system of communication with the other children. Daily routine and health challenges. Life on the Blackwood property followed a rigorous routine established by Ezekiel. Children were awakened before dawn to perform tasks on the small farm that ensured the family's livelihood. They cultivated corn, potatoes, and beans, and kept some pigs and chickens. Limited to the little Martha and Ruth could teach, formal education was virtually non-existent. It's essential to understand the context of the time, says historian Dr. Morgan. In Appalachian rural areas during that period, it wasn't uncommon for children to receive little or no formal education. Child labor in family farming was the norm, not the exception. This helped camouflage the Blackwood situation, as the children's educational isolation didn't arouse suspicion. The children's health was precarious. Many treatable conditions became chronic and debilitating without access to appropriate medical care. Eleanor, Martha's third daughter, born in 1942, developed severe scoliosis which, without treatment, resulted in a spinal deformity that limited her movements. Even so, records suggest she worked in the medicinal herbal garden Martha kept, learning how to use local plants to treat common ailments. The use of traditional herbal medicine was common in Appalachian rural communities, explains Dr. Margaret Wilson, an ethnobotany expert. Many of these communities were days away from the nearest doctor, so they developed a deep knowledge of the medicinal properties of local plants. This knowledge was likely crucial for the survival of many of the children in the Blackwood case. The case of the twins, Thomas and Timothy, born to Ruth in 1944, was particularly tragic. Both were born with a cleft palate and a cleft lip, conditions that made speech and feeding difficult. Timothy, who also had a deformity in his left leg, died at age 4 after contracting pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Thomas survived but developed a severe speech problem that isolated him even further within an already isolated environment. The continuation of the cycle and the approaching end. As the children matured, Ezekiel implemented the most disturbing aspect of his plan, the continuation of the consanguinity cycle. When Joseph turned 16 in 1954, Ezekiel began preparing him to assume what he termed family responsibilities. Decades later, Ezekiel's diaries were found, describing in clinical and disturbing detail how he planned to use Joseph to strengthen the lineage with his own half-sisters when they reached the proper age. What we see here is the perpetuation of a cycle of intergenerational abuse, says Dr. Helen Richards, a psychologist specializing in family trauma. Ezekiel was not merely imposing his control over his sisters, but planning to extend that control to the next generation, creating a legacy of trauma that could continue indefinitely had it not been interrupted. The family's isolation was maintained through a combination of misinformation and fear. Children were taught early on that the outside world was dangerous and hostile. Ezekiel reinforced this belief by reporting stories, often completely manufactured or exaggerated, about people who had been persecuted or killed because they were different, creating an obvious parallel with his children's situation. This form of manipulation is a classic tactic in coercive control situations, explains Dr. Richards. By convincing victims that the abusive environment is safer than the outside world, the perpetrator eliminates the possibility of seeking help or escape. In the Blackwood case, the isolation was particularly effective due to the limited social interaction and the remote location. As the 1950s advanced, the situation on the Blackwood property became increasingly unsustainable. The growing number of children, many with significant medical needs, strained the family's limited resources. Martha's health was severely compromised after 9 pregnancies in precarious conditions. Ruth, the younger sister, continued the cycle of forced pregnancies, giving birth to her 7th son in 1956. Living conditions visibly deteriorated. The main house, never properly maintained, began to have serious structural issues. Reports indicate the family was forced to concentrate in only a few rooms of the main house to conserve heat during the particularly severe winter of 1956 to 1957 in the region, leading to overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. It was in this context of escalating deterioration that events began to converge toward the inevitable moment when the outside world would finally uncover the horrors of the Blackwood property. The catalyst for this discovery would be a desperate decision made by Rebecca, then 18, which would forever alter the family's fate. Rebecca's escape and the discovery. What occurred on the Blackwood property represents one of the most extreme cases of documented consanguinity and isolation in modern United States history, concludes Dr. Morgan. It is a disturbing case study on how geographical isolation, authoritarian control, and poverty can create the conditions for systematic abuse to remain hidden for decades. The year 1957 marked the beginning of the end of Ezekiel Blackwood's reign of terror. The winter that year was particularly brutal in the Appalachian Mountains, with snowfalls that further isolated the already remote Blackwood property and temperatures that reached 30 degrees below zero. It was during this winter that Rebecca, then 18, started planning her escape. She developed an unshakable determination and her own moral conscience, despite her hearing impairment and being raised in extreme isolation. Rebecca represented an anomaly within the closed system Ezekiel created, explains Dr. Richards. Despite all the attempts at indoctrination and isolation, she developed a critical perspective on her situation. This is not uncommon for survivors of abusive environments. Even in extreme situations, human resilience can manifest in surprising ways. Considering her limited understanding of the outside world, Rebecca's plan was bold. For years, she had secretly collected and hidden small useful items, matches, a pocket knife, pieces of rope, and even a rudimentary map of the county she found in an old book in the house. She also secretly saved food from meals, drying it to preserve it. A desperate journey. The opportunity arose in February 1957 during one of Ezekiel's rare trips to the city for supplies. He usually took Joseph with him on these occasions, but this time, he decided to leave him behind to help fix the roof of one of the cabins that had collapsed under the snow's weight. With Ezekiel absent and Joseph occupied, Rebecca seized the chance. Taking only a small bundle with her few provisions and belongings, she escaped through the forest in the midst of a snowfall, using the bad weather to cover her tracks. What followed was a desperate and epic journey. For 3 days, Rebecca wandered through the snow-covered mountains, guiding herself by the stars at night and the sun during the day, as she had learned from observing Ezekiel. Facing freezing temperatures and without proper equipment, she suffered severe cold at the extremities and hypothermia. When we consider what Rebecca endured, her survival is almost unbelievable, says Dr. William Harper, a remote medicine expert. A young woman with a hearing impairment, with no experience in the outside world, crossing one of the most inhospitable regions of the Appalachians during a blizzard. The chances were minimal. Her willpower speaks volumes about her survival. Unfolding the horror. On the morning of the 4th day, Rebecca was found by Edgar Thompson, a local hunter, who initially mistook her for an injured animal. Suffering from advanced hypothermia and semi-conscious, she was rushed to the small clinic in Welsh, the nearest town. What followed was the slow unveiling of a horror that the local community could barely comprehend. Due to her hearing limitations and exhaustion, Rebecca initially communicated through rudimentary drawings. It was nurse Sarah Collins who finally established an effective communication system with the young woman. "I will never forget the moment I understood what she was trying to tell us," Collins said years later in an interview with the local newspaper. "At first, I thought I was misinterpreting, that it was impossible, but the more she explained, the clearer it became that we were facing something truly horrible." Local Sheriff Frank Miller, initially skeptical, organized a small expedition to the Blackwood property to investigate Rebecca's allegations. What they found confirmed their worst fears. 15 people living in deplorable conditions, many with significant signs and visible deformities. "It was like stepping into another world," said Deputy James Wilson, who accompanied the sheriff on that first visit. The main house was in a state of advanced decomposition. The smell of illness and mold was oppressive. Younger children looked at us as if they had never seen strangers before. Others hid, some were paralyzed with fear. Ezekiel, surprised by the authorities' arrival, initially tried to explain the situation as a case of an unusual family that preferred to live in isolation. He became aggressive and attempted to resist arrest when confronted with Rebecca's specific allegations. Several deputies were needed to contain him. Legal and social challenges. Martha and Ruth, after decades of isolation and abuse, showed clear signs of deep psychological trauma. They initially defended Ezekiel, a typical behavior of prolonged abuse victims. They only began to speak about the horrors they had faced after weeks of counseling and medical care. The Blackwood case challenged all existing protocols at the time, explains Dr. Linda Peterson, a historian specializing in rural social services. In 1957, the social service system in rural areas was virtually non-existent. There was no precedent for dealing with a case of this complexity and magnitude. The authorities, medical services, and local community had to improvise, creating answers as they went along. The story of the Blackwood family exploded in the local media and eventually attracted national attention. The newspapers of the time covered the case with a blend of morbid sensationalism and genuine horror. Headlines like "Horror Family in the Mountains" and "The Appalachian Shame" dominated the front pages. For the Blackwood children, the rescue represented a new kind of trauma. Suddenly exposed to a world they didn't understand, many showed severe adaptation difficulties. The authorities struggled to determine what to do with them, as there were no adequate facilities for their specific needs. The system was simply unprepared for such a case, continues Dr. Peterson. There were no specialized institutions for children with multiple disabilities resulting from consanguinity. The options were limited to psychiatric institutions or general orphanages, neither of which were suitable for their needs. Trial and aftermath. The discovery of the Blackwood family also raised unprecedented legal issues. Ezekiel was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including private imprisonment, kidnapping, and other offenses. However, the laws of the time did not specifically address the type of systematic and multi-generational abuse he had perpetrated. The Blackwood case revealed significant gaps in the legal system, explains Dr. Harold Jenkins, professor of historical criminal law. Prosecutors had to be creative in applying existing laws. This case would eventually contribute to the evolution of legislation related to child neglect and family abuse in the following decades. Ezekiel Blackwood's trial, held in 1958, was one of Western Virginia's most sensational. Although his lawyers attempted to claim insanity, Ezekiel was deemed mentally capable of facing trial. His conviction was critically dependent on the testimonies of Martha and Ruth, despite their painful nature. The trial records reveal a man who, until the very end, believed his actions were justified, says Dr. Jenkins. Ezekiel often interrupted the proceedings to explain his theories about the superiority of his family lineage and genetic purity. His apparent lack of remorse shocked even the most seasoned court observers. Ezekiel Blackwood was sentenced to multiple consecutive penalties, ensuring he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. He died at the West Virginia State Penitentiary in 1972, seemingly without ever showing regret for his actions. For Martha and Ruth, freedom arrived, a freedom that initially seemed as frightening as their captivity. After receiving extensive medical treatment, the two sisters were slowly reintegrated into society. Martha's health had been severely compromised by 9 pregnancies in precarious conditions, and she never fully recovered. She lived her final years at a nursing home in Charleston, where she died in 1975 from heart complications. Ruth, being younger and having suffered less physical damage, achieved a more substantial recovery. With the support of local religious groups and social programs, she eventually learned to read and write and spent her final years working as a volunteer in a shelter for women victims of domestic violence. She died in 1988, having dedicated 3 decades of her free life to helping other women escape abusive situations. Ruth's story stands as a remarkable testament to human resilience, says Dr. Richards. After decades of unimaginable abuse, she not only survived but found a purpose in helping other victims. Her journey reminds us that recovery and transformation are possible, even after the most severe trauma. The legacy of consanguinity. The consequences of Ezekiel Blackwood's distorted genetic experiment extended far beyond the initial rescue of the children in 1957. For the 11 surviving children, the impact of extreme consanguinity would shape the remainder of their lives, creating social, psychological, and medical challenges that the science of the time was just beginning to grasp. The Blackwood case represents one of the first documented studies of extreme multi-generational consanguinity in the United States, explains Dr. Edward Roberts, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. From a scientific perspective, it offered valuable insights into the effects of severe inbreeding on humans, though at an unacceptable human cost. Initial medical evaluations of the Blackwood children revealed an alarming spectrum of conditions. Beyond the visible physical deformities, such as Eleanor's scoliosis, Thomas's cleft lip, and polydactyly observed in several siblings, more serious internal problems were revealed by detailed exams. 6 of the 11 children had congenital cardiac defects of varying severity. 8 showed impaired renal function. Almost all exhibited some degree of cognitive impairment, though the extent varied significantly from child to child. What we observed in the Blackwood case is the effect of so-called inbreeding depression, continues Dr. Roberts. When genetically close individuals have children, the probability of harmful recessive genes manifesting drastically increases. In cases of extreme consanguinity, such as multiple generations of siblings, these effects are exponentially amplified. Adaptation and long-term effects. The health system of the 1950s was ill-equipped to handle such complex cases. Blackwood children were distributed among various specialized institutions and hospitals in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia, often separated from one another, which added emotional trauma to their already significant physical challenges. Joseph, the firstborn Ezekiel was grooming to continue his distorted legacy, had the most complex psychological case. Assessments revealed a severely fragmented personality, alternating between psychotic episodes and periods of lucidity. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he spent most of his adulthood in psychiatric institutions, dying in 1983 at age 45. Rebecca, whose brave escape had exposed the case, faced her own challenges. Later exams, in addition to her hearing impairment, revealed a cardiac condition that required multiple surgeries. Despite these difficulties, she demonstrated a remarkable adaptability. With the support of dedicated social workers, she learned sign language and eventually graduated from high school through a special program. Rebecca became a symbol of hope, comments Marion Foster, one of the social workers who worked with the Blackwood children. Despite everything she faced, she maintained an insatiable curiosity about the world and an unshakable determination to create a better life for herself. Thomas, who survived after his twin brother Timothy passed away in childhood, perhaps faced the most difficult path, with severe speech problems and multiple facial deformities. He endured significant social rejection, even within the institutions created to help him. Medical records indicate he underwent 17 reconstructive surgeries between 1958 and 1970, with limited results. Thomas's case illustrates how the effects of consanguinity extend far beyond the physical, says Dr. Richards. The psychological impact of growing up not only with visible deformities but also with the knowledge of their origin created additional layers of trauma that medical treatments couldn't address. Final years and scientific contribution. The destination of the younger children, born in the 1950s, was equally challenging. Mary, Martha's last daughter, born in 1956, had a rare genetic condition that affected bone development. At 2, when rescued, she could barely sit without support. Subsequent medical evaluations revealed she also suffered from severe visual problems, only seeing basic forms and figures. Children born in the final stages of this consanguinity cycle had even more severe conditions, explains Dr. Roberts. This aligns with what we know about prolonged consanguinity. The effects tend to intensify across generations as the genetic pool becomes increasingly limited. The medical history of the Blackwood children became an important case study for the emerging genetics of the time. Doctors and researchers, recognizing the scientific value of these cases despite their tragic origins, meticulously documented each condition, creating one of the first comprehensive records of extreme consanguinity's effects on humans. It's vital to understand that human genetics was still in its infancy in the 1950s, says Dr. Fisher. DNA itself had been identified as genetic material only a few years prior, in 1944, and its structure was discovered by Watson and Crick in 1953. The Blackwood case occurred at a pivotal moment for genetic science. The information gathered from the Blackwood children contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of the mechanisms of heredity and the risks of consanguinity. Studies based on their cases were published in medical journals throughout the 1960s and 1970s, always using pseudonyms to protect their identities. A difficult integration. In addition to medical challenges, the Blackwood children faced significant obstacles to social integration. Having grown up in extreme isolation, many showed severe difficulties in socialization and adapting to basic behavioral standards. Some, despite years of therapy, never developed age-appropriate common skills, remaining functionally nonverbal. What we observe in the most severe cases among the Blackwood children is the combined impact of compromised genetics and extreme social deprivation, explains Dr. Patterson. It's impossible to completely separate how much of their cognitive and behavioral challenges resulted from genetic factors and how much was a consequence of the abusive and isolated environment in which they were raised. The social assistance system of the 1950s and 1960s struggled to properly handle such complex cases. Many of the Blackwood children underwent multiple placements transferred between specialized institutions, hospitals, and orphanages as their needs evolved or when existing facilities proved inadequate. We must remember that this was a time when institutionalization was the standard response for children with significant disabilities, says Dr. Peterson. The family-centered service model and community integration, which we would consider standard today, simply did not exist as viable options. Some of the Blackwood children, particularly those with less severe disabilities, eventually achieved some degree of independence. Eleanor, despite her severe scoliosis, developed exceptional handicraft skills and eventually earned a living by creating detailed tapestries, some of which were exhibited in regional folk art galleries. Rebecca, whose escape had exposed the case, perhaps built the most conventional life among all the siblings. After completing her education, she worked as an assistant in a Pittsburgh library for over 3 decades. Although she never had children or married, a decision, according to her diaries, influenced by the fear of transmitting troubled genes, she developed a close circle of friends and was known for her involvement in causes for people with disabilities. Rebecca's journey from extreme isolation to advocacy is remarkable, says Dr. Richards. She transformed her trauma into a commitment to helping others, especially people with hearing impairment. Her diaries reveal someone who spent her life seeking to understand her own story and using that understanding to create positive change. Conclusion. For others, however, Ezekiel Blackwood's legacy proved impossible to overcome. 4 of the 11 surviving children never left institutional environments, requiring 24-hour care due to the severity of their cognitive and physical conditions. The institutions where they lived reported that, even decades after their rescue, some still exhibited severe trauma behaviors, such as reacting with terror to certain stimuli that triggered traumatic memories or rocking the body repeatedly. Researchers and doctors continued to monitor the Blackwood children over the years, always with the consent of their legal guardians or their own. This long-term follow-up has provided valuable insights into how the effects of prolonged trauma and consanguinity evolve throughout life. What we learned from monitoring the Blackwood children was that some conditions tend to worsen with age, explains Dr. Roberts. For instance, heart problems managed in youth often became more severe in middle age. Several of them developed kidney failure at relatively young ages, requiring transplants or dialysis. The life expectancy of the Blackwood children proved significantly reduced. Of the 11 rescued in 1957, only 3 lived past the age of 50. Most died from complications related to congenital conditions that were exacerbated by aging. Every body system was affected by consanguinity in some way, continues Dr. Roberts. Metabolic problems made it difficult to regulate blood glucose. The compromised immune system made them more vulnerable to infections. Bone deformities often led to severe and early arthritis. It was as if aging occurred at an accelerated pace.